War erupts. Israel and Iran cross the line. Without warning, without announcement, there was no live broadcast, no official statement. Only an ominous wail in the sky, the roar of explosions, and lightning-fast images of destruction spreading faster than explanations could arrive. The war between Israel and Iran was no longer a possibility. It became a sudden yet predictable reality. No invitations, no diplomatic formalities, no illusions. At first, it seemed like a rumor, then an overload of news channels, but very quickly it became clear. It was all real. Iran and Israel had crossed the line long considered the final frontier of deterrence, the line beyond which a full-scale conflict begins. The streets of Tel Aviv and Haifa were silent, not because nothing was happening, but because too much was happening. The sound of sirens became the first music of this new phase of war. People ran from their homes, frantically seeking shelter. In the sky, launch flashes, then columns of smoke. The initial strikes hit not military targets, as might have been expected, but civilian infrastructure and logistics hubs. This wasn't just an act of aggression, it was a message that no one was now out of reach. From both sides, there were no condemnations, no attempts at negotiation. All previous diplomacy seemed to be cast aside, as if the conflict, brewing behind headlines for years, had finally erupted and no longer needed justification. No capital took the initiative to mediate. No ally offered a platform for de-escalation. Everyone watched and remained silent. In Tel Aviv, I saw streets instantly empty. Even for those accustomed to the constant presence of threat, this felt different. Not a localized shelling, not an isolated attack. It felt like the beginning of something uncontrollable. Stores closed, public transport ground to a halt, and emergency services were stretched to their limits. Yet, it wasn't enough. The destruction wasn't just physical, it was a blow to the very confidence in security. If there was once an illusion that certain areas, targets, or cities were protected, everything had now changed. Tel Aviv, with its modern air defense systems, was under fire. Haifa, a logistics and naval hub, was also hit. And this was only the first day. Information channels were overwhelmed with reports, yet official sources remained silent. The Israeli army made no statements. Iran did not claim responsibility for the attacks, but everything was already visible. Burning buildings, evacuated hospitals, casualties, chaotic aerial combat, and a deafening silence on the ground, as if reality itself decided to pause for a moment. This was not a gesture of force. It was the language of war, a language in which missiles replaced diplomats and fire replaced statements. It no longer mattered who said what last week, nor who pressed the button first. Everything had shifted to a phase where air defense systems, strategic coordinates, and the countdown to the next strike played the dominant role. Meanwhile, deep within the unfolding events, it was clear that this war wasn't just a conflict between two countries. It was a vibration that could reach anywhere. If one missile missed its mark, the flames could engulf those who thought they were unaffected. This was no longer just Tehran and Jerusalem. It was energy markets, shipping lanes, international agreements, food supplies, and logistics chains. It was the global order called into question. While some tried to understand why the strike was so massive, others remembered, the war didn't start now. It had lived in the shadows of headlines, between pauses at the UN General Assembly, in unspoken threats during negotiations in Vienna and Geneva. Now, all of it had materialized. No one knew what lay ahead. Would there be a second strike? A retaliation? A chance to stop? But one thing was clear on this first day. Someone had opened a door that had been closed for decades, and now no one knew how to shut it again. The shadow of nuclear fear, a preemptive strike. When the first missiles began to fall, many thought it was just another escalation in the Middle East conflict. But everything changed when the targets of the attack emerged. Not just headquarters, depots, and airfields, but something never before mentioned aloud: nuclear infrastructure. Not from both sides, but from one, and that was enough to make it clear. The conflict was affecting not just territories, but the very foundations of nuclear deterrence. Israel has never officially acknowledged possessing a nuclear arsenal. No UN declarations, no parades with atomic warheads. Yet in the shadows of expert reports and geopolitical realities, there had always been an unspoken axiom: Israel has it, as a symbol of the last word in any military logic, as a guarantee of inviolability. And then there was Iran, a country that had pursued its nuclear program for decades, reactor by reactor, laboratory by laboratory, enriched uranium, centrifuges, new facilities appearing in satellite images in deserts, mountains, underground. Initially, just technical facilities, then a potential threat, all accompanied by negotiations, sanctions, IAEA inspections. But somewhere beyond these lines and protocols, in the Israeli military consciousness, lived something far deeper: the fear of a point of no return, of a moment when Iran could not only enrich uranium, but turn it into a weapon. And not just any weapon, but one aimed at annihilation. From this perspective, even one functioning nuclear device in Iran became a question not of Iran's survival, but of Israel's survival. This was the paradox. It was the awareness of the probability of the threat, not its actual presence, that triggered the action. And these actions were not improvised. When Israel launched a preemptive strike on Iranian facilities, it wasn't an emotional outburst. It was an operation meticulously planned to the microsecond. According to leaked reports, Mossad had already embedded assets in areas near key nuclear facilities months before, including a drone base, a quiet facility hidden in the mountains, not marked on maps. When the missiles flew, they hit not just antennas and launchers, they targeted the brain. Strikes hit scientific centers, command posts, and laboratories where leading specialists from the IRGC worked. According to local sources, some scientists died, others were evacuated or disappeared. Laboratories turned to ashes. Local media reported that even a state television channel was among the targets, and one of its leading programs was interrupted by a direct hit on the building. 3 employees died. The anchors miraculously survived. This was not just a strike on infrastructure. It was a signal that now any point, even a media outlet, could be a target. But the most important consequence was not registered by radars, because the key thing that shattered at that moment was the balance. The silent consensus on the inadmissibility of attacking neighbors' nuclear components, even if undeclared. Iran's response was swift and equally unemotional. It was named Operation Vows. The name spoke for itself, not a burst of rage, but the execution of a long-standing plan. And therein lies the main difference. The strike on Iran's nuclear architecture provoked a response targeting the control center of Israeli military resources. The target was the military complex in Tel Aviv, unofficially known outside Israel as the Pentagon of the Middle East. A strike on it was not just a strike on a building. It was an attack on the entire system of war management, logistics, finance, and personnel. The strategic center was damaged, confirmed even by neutral satellite observers. Smoke, thermal radiation, evacuation were observed. It was also recorded that the consular district, where a building used by the American side is located, was affected by the attack. This meant one thing: no ally was safe. The attack had global implications, even if its execution was local. However, it must be acknowledged that despite the precision of the Israeli strike, Iran was prepared. Some missiles did hit decoys, model antennas, false heat signatures, mobile convoys of equipment, all part of Iran's disinformation tactics. Real facilities were likely moved underground, indicating that in this war, not only missiles, but also intelligence matters. Who will outwit whom? Who will be one step ahead? And now it becomes clear, no one will stop, because in this game, the stakes have long exceeded local objectives. It's not just about oil, not just about politics. It's about no one wanting to be the first to hesitate, especially when a word no longer spoken aloud, nuclear, looms in the shadows. Invisible attack, visible explosion. When Iranian facilities were struck, it didn't look like the beginning of a typical military operation. There was no usual preliminary escalation, no slow buildup of forces, no leaks to the press. Everything happened in silence, precisely, like a well-oiled algorithm. And it wasn't accidental. It was an attack planned down to the last pixel on satellite images, to the last slot on the radar screen. Israel didn't wait for the threat to become obvious. The move was calculated long ago. Strikes on logistics, then on command, then on nuclear coordination. According to analytical centers in Europe, over 200 combat units were involved, including F-35 fighters, attack drones, and medium-range missiles. They attacked simultaneously from the air, from the sea, through cyberspace. The geography of the strike covered the entire western sector of Iran, including port hubs, air defense complexes, radar stations, and major scientific centers. One of the most important targets under attack was the command post for nuclear program oversight. It was there, according to intelligence, that plans for centrifuge modernization and calculations for achieving weapons-grade uranium enrichment were stored. What had long been discussed at conferences in Vienna and Geneva suddenly turned to dust and flames, Engineers, scientists, and specialists who worked in these laboratories were either killed, wounded, or evacuated to an unknown location. It was quite surprising that the strike also hit the National Television Building. 3 employees died, and several others were injured. One of the anchors narrowly escaped death on live television. The camera kept rolling, the microphone kept recording, but behind them, voices were no longer heard, only fire, screams, and the clang of broken glass. This episode became a symbol of a war where there were no longer boundaries between the front and the studio, between weapons and words. Simultaneously, special drones began operating in the skies over Iran, which, according to independent analysts, were designed not only for striking but also for jamming. Their task was to disrupt communications, confuse warning systems, and mislead air defenses. It was at this moment that the second phase of the operation began. Massive strikes on facilities in Isfahan and Bushehr, as well as on a drone base in the Zanjan region. However, despite the precision and scale of the Israeli strike, Iran was prepared. As later became known, most critical facilities had been disguised in advance. Infrared traps, false antennas, holographic projections, even inflatable decoys of equipment were used. Some missiles indeed hit empty decoy buildings specifically built for such scenarios. It was a game of chess, but with explosives. Israel attacked, Iran parried, but all this happened outside the usual picture of war. Neither side officially confirmed its losses. All statements were cautiously ambiguous. It seemed as if they were both fighting and trying not to admit how far they had gone. And yet, the effect was noticeable. Airspace over the Middle East became impassable. International flights were diverted, ports were closed, cargo was turned back or rerouted, increasing delivery times by weeks. Even those not involved in the conflict felt its breath, because this was no longer just an attack on Iran. It was a demonstration of how modern warfare operates, silently, without declarations, without mercy. Against this backdrop, Tehran began its retaliatory operation, but even here, everything was calculated. The response was named 3 Vows, a reference to long-formulated principles of countering aggression. It was not a hysterical reaction, but a plan implemented step by step. The first targets were not random objects, but the military command center in Tel Aviv, precisely where the main control center for the Israeli army, logistics, and coordination of operations abroad is located. The next strike hit Haifa, Israel's main seaport, through which ammunition, fuel, and strategic cargo pass. A hit on the port was a blow to the back of Israel's entire combat system. Fires engulfed oil depots, and explosions disrupted the movement of military convoys. For several hours, access to northern supply routes was hampered, confirmed even by Western analytical centers. But the attack was not limited exclusively to military targets. The diplomatic quarter was also damaged, specifically a building used by the American side. The nature of the damage indicated that the target was symbolic, not the scale of destruction. This was a political message. In this war, there is no rear, and if Israel believes its allies will be its refuge, then they too are at risk. The most resonant information was that the regional office of Israeli intelligence, Mossad, was targeted. Although Israel categorically denied such statements, Iranian sources claimed that the building was the target of one of the most precise missiles. Given the level of secrecy and the lack of direct evidence, this remains an unproven claim. But even if it's just a psychological operation, it worked. An internal review of all external intelligence units began in Israel. Special emphasis should be placed on the nature of the attacks. Iran did not use a single wave. There was a clear 3-phase scheme. First, the launch of over 100 drones whose purpose was not destruction but diversion. They created false signals, overloaded air defenses, and misled them. Then came ballistic missiles. Not the newest, not the most powerful, but numerous. Their task was to overload the priority targets of Israeli air defense systems, forcing them to choose whom to intercept and whom to let through. And only after the Iron Dome was saturated did Iran bring its new weapon into play, hypersonic missiles. They were launched when Israeli defenses had already exhausted some of their interceptor stocks. These missiles fly faster, maneuver, and are virtually undetectable by conventional radars. It was they who broke through the final line of defense. According to estimates, the effectiveness of Israeli air defense fell from the usual 90% to 10-15%. This is not just a reduction, it's a failure. Individual missiles were not intercepted even in areas previously considered absolutely protected. In Ramat Gan and northern Tel Aviv, missiles reached their targets. One warhead hit a command reserve building, another caused a fire at a power distribution substation. It became clear that the Iron Dome concept is good for short, targeted conflicts, but it cannot withstand the onslaught of a strategic campaign with multi-wave, asymmetric attacks. Iran proved that in modern combat, victory goes not to whoever has better technology, but to whoever can make that technology ARR. Moreover, the attack revealed another weakness: the stock of interceptors. Each launch of a Tamir missile used in the Iron Dome costs between $40,000 and $100,000. In massive attacks, the system literally burns millions of dollars per hour, and when every third target is a decoy, resources are wasted. This is economic exhaustion in real time. Israeli military experts began discussing the question: is modernization possible? Yes, but it will hardly be quick. New laser complexes like Iron Beam are not yet fully deployed, and existing air defense batteries are too dependent on human operators who need to make dozens of decisions in seconds. In conditions of information overload, this becomes impossible. Meanwhile, public opinion within the country was shaken. People accustomed to believing that even during a massive attack, their homes were covered by a protective dome now had to face a new reality. Absolute protection does not exist. Queues at shelters, sleeping bags in metro stations, urgent installations of street loudspeakers, all this returned Israelis to a state they hadn't experienced since the Second Lebanon War. The government admitted that the entire national security architecture needed to be reevaluated. The creation of a special commission for air defense reform was announced, including not only generals but also specialists in AI, cybersecurity, and geospatial analysis. It sounds confident, but changes will take time, and the war, as dynamics show, will not wait. At the same time, videos of failed interceptions spread on social media. In one, an air defense missile can be seen rising vertically, then losing its course and veering off. Users uploaded footage not so much of destruction as of system errors. This hits reputation, psychology, and trust. However, the most disturbing thing is not the missed missiles, but the understanding that the enemy learns faster. Iran, long under sanctions and isolation, demonstrated not just technology, but the ability to adapt. War no longer requires parity, it requires flexibility, and right now, that flexibility is on the side of the attacker. Shards of war, prices, fear, global shock. When the missiles finally fell silent, if only for half an hour, everything seemed to freeze. But the silence brought no relief, only a sharp realization. Even if the strikes ceased, the consequences had already arrived. And it wasn't just about destroyed buildings, dead and wounded. The true effect of the war was global, multi-layered, and almost unstoppable. And it was felt far beyond the borders of Israel and Iran. The energy market was the first to falter. After the initial strikes on the ports of Haifa and reports of possible disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices jumped to $104 per barrel. Stock exchanges that were stable in the morning recorded sharp drops by evening. Major stock indexes in Europe and Asia plunged into the red. Logistics took another hit. Half of the cargo heading through the Middle East was temporarily suspended. International airlines canceled dozens of flights, and sea shipments were either delayed or rerouted, increasing delivery times by weeks. In Israel, electricity was cut off in dozens of areas. Traffic lights in Tel Aviv temporarily stopped working. One of Haifa's largest logistics terminals ceased functioning. Medical facilities, despite preparations, were overwhelmed. Beds were scarce, blood supplies were running low, and volunteers worked around the clock. But the most significant loss was the sense of normalcy. People who had been shopping yesterday were hiding in basements today. Children who had just started their summer holidays were now sleeping in bomb shelters. Those not physically wounded were mentally traumatized. Fear permeated everything, followed by bewilderment. In Iran, it was no better. Casualties from Israeli strikes were higher than expected. Although many key facilities were protected, missiles still damaged both military infrastructure and civilian areas. Over 200 dead, over 400 wounded, damaged scientific laboratories, airfields, television towers. The country was in mourning but preparing for a new stage of war. On the international arena, diplomatic chaos erupted. France and Germany called for an immediate ceasefire but did not propose a mechanism for its implementation. The U.S. officially declared support for Israel but emphasized that it would not become directly involved unless attacked. China called for restraint but simultaneously began to strengthen its presence in the Strait of Hormuz, clearly protecting its energy interests. Analysts spoke of a bifurcation point. the world found itself at a crossroads. One path, escalation to the involvement of third countries, including Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and then global players. The other path, a diplomatic window that narrows with each passing day. The problem is that no one wants to be the first to retreat, making the world a hostage to strategic pride. Psychological fatigue was palpable everywhere. People feared not only the next missile, but also tomorrow. The economy was already faltering. Inflation, rising prices, supply disruptions. In developing countries, new waves of protests began. Georgia, Bangladesh, Tunisia, all related to rising fuel and food prices. And all this was the echo of a conflict between two countries that could have been local, but became global. Because in a world where war in one region is a chain reaction, the water in the Mediterranean Sea trembles from vibrations, and bread prices in Egypt rise from missiles in Haifa. It became clear. There's more to come. Israel continues to strengthen its defense, but loses strategic positions. Iran does not retreat, but only changes the format of its strikes. Secret services are activated, cyber attacks become a new front. And in this chaos, the main thing is lost. Who and why started it? And is it possible to stop it now? Today, the world stands on the brink. And if anyone thinks this is just another Middle Eastern escalation, they are mistaken. This could be the beginning of a completely different conflict, where the weapons are not only missiles, but also prices, fear, panic, and the destruction of trust. No one feels safe, not in Tel Aviv, nor in Tehran, nor in Berlin, nor in Jakarta, because everything that is happening now is not just a war. It is a crack in the glass of global peace, and if it is not stopped, it will spread across the entire surface. The conflict between Israel and Iran has escalated into the largest geopolitical crisis in recent years. Beginning with pinpoint strikes, it has transformed into a systemic war affecting key military centers, strategic logistics, energy, and the global economy. Iran employed a multi-layered tactic aimed at overwhelming air defense systems, while Israel used high-precision strikes on scientific and military infrastructure. The world, watching this confrontation, found itself in a hostage situation. Rising oil prices, worsening inflation, supply disruptions, diplomatic inaction, all became side effects of a war that has spilled beyond regional borders. At its heart remains the feeling that further escalation is only a matter of time, and if countries do not find the strength and mechanism to stop it, this conflict risks becoming not an episode, but a prologue to a new era, an era where neither the balance of deterrence, nor humanitarian rules, nor logic applies, only destruction. And the question is no longer who is right, but whether anyone will be left to explain.